The enormous majority of Jews suffered anonymous deaths in Auschwitz. No one asked them for their names. No one registered them or gave them numbers. There was no reason to do so. They were going to die the most quickly, and no trace of them was to be left. Even so, it was stated on the basis of partially preserved documents and the testimony of witnesses that the poet Itzhak Katzenelson, a brother of pre-war French Prime Minister René Blum, was among the victims. As were Edith Stein, Professor Husserl's assistant and a Catholic nun. Also the mother and sister of Nobel Peace Prize winner Elie Wiesel. Thousands and hundreds of thousands were not even head counted. They were to die, and that was the end of it. Their ashes were spread on the fields or swallowed by ponds and the Vistula River. After the ashes were jettisoned, valuables and objects remained which could bring riches to the SS and vast benefits for the Reich treasury. The victims were tricked prior to their last ever journey to life and work in the East, to take their tools and valuables with them. These landed up in the camp so-called Canada stores, presumably because Canada meant prosperity and affluence. There was so much looted property that several hundred prisoners in more than 30 barracks were employed full-time to deal with it. The clothing, footwear, watches and spectacles were for the people at home and the frontline soldiers. The gold and valuables were for the SS. Other materials went for reprocessing. Even the ashes of those cremated were used as a fertilizer. Having said that, the Canada stores were full to the end of the camp's existence, and part of the deposits can be seen today in the Auschwitz Museum. This was established by the Polish government as a national institution which cared for what was left of the camp, to be maintained for time immemorial. This is the museum as it looks today. There can surely be nothing more tragic than a girl's tress of hair that's been cut off, a curl wound with such detailed care. The Third Reich needed even these tresses for military production, robbery to the last strand of hair. Jews classified by the doctors as fit to work landed up in the camp, not to live and survive, but to die from superhuman effort in inhuman conditions, destruction through work. Such were the practical details of the final solution. In the meantime, however, Jews, alongside non-Jews, received their striped uniforms with identification tags and their prisoner numbers tattooed on their forearms. They lived in barracks, a whole city of barracks. Some 400,000 persons received camp numbers in the Gestapo register. Despite the unbearable crowding in the overfull barracks, the people there, deprived of the most elementary intimate features of life, were taught, as if in mockery, "Off hats in barracks, a louse can kill you." There were many enemies: hunger, damp, cold, rain and snow, illness and epidemics, but none caused as many deaths as did the Nazis themselves. The Germans knew how to create instruments of torture, humiliation and degradation out of everything. The camp rules even limited the time a prisoner could spend visiting the latrine. Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the German nation, himself called the Jews and Gypsies human dregs. They were to fertilize the great German living space with their ashes. An order of the 29th of January 1943 had whole Gypsy families transported to Auschwitz, where they were placed in Birkenau section B2E. The Gypsy camp register, which survived the war, held 21,000 names. They died of hunger, cold and illnesses. The less than 3,000 who survived were gassed on the 2nd of August, 1944. As though the ordinary camp rules were not enough, penal companies were established in August 1940. At the beginning, Jews and priests had priority in being allocated to them. Later, their ranks were supplemented by political prisoners and those suspected of preparing to escape or of belonging to the camp resistance movement. It was here that prisoners were to pay for their origins, beliefs and opinions. They were assigned to the most dangerous and exhausting jobs: land improvement, cleaning out ponds, road building. The penal company's supervisors were the most bestial of the SS guards. An occasion to a penal company augured imminent death. A desperate escape attempt from the penal company took place on the 10th of June 1942. It mainly comprised Poles, for they were then in the majority in the company. 9 managed to escape. The remaining were executed by the Germans. Some blocks had a particularly gruesome history. For example, Block 25 in the women's camp in Birkenau. Women were sent there as a death sentence if they were sick, looked sick, or simply unable to work. They had to wait in this block until there was room for them in the gas chambers. During this time, they received neither food nor water. Block 11 in the main camp has gone down in Auschwitz history as the death block. It was the detention prison where death sentences passed in the camp were carried out. The Gestapo court in Silesia also passed verdicts here on prisoners brought in from Upper Silesia. The investigation proceedings here had almost always one and the same sentence: in the name of the German nation, death. The travesty of court trials lasted no longer than required to check the identification of the accused. That was all that was needed. Those sentenced there were shot on the spot. Sometimes they were shot in the washroom. However, usually they had to undress in the washroom and then were marched out to the yard. Several steps to the right, to the execution wall, the order, and then the shot. A pretext for further oppression and torture was the daily roll call of the prisoners. Several times public executions by hanging took place during roll calls. The poorly dressed, sometimes barefoot prisoners waited for hours in the wind and cold for escapees to be caught. Order was imperative. If someone had escaped, the SS would sometimes select 10 or 20 prisoners and sentence them to death by starvation. In one such case, a young prisoner selected to die in the starvation cell was exchanged for Father Maximilian Kolbe, a Polish Franciscan monk, who asked that his life be taken instead of that of his fellow man. The legend and memory of that event, of a person voluntarily going to his death, is an essential part of what happened in Auschwitz. Every day, there also would have been small acts of human heroism and altruism among the prisoners. When Pope John Paul II visited Auschwitz in 1979, he drew attention to the fact that the people who practiced such acts included those of various beliefs and differing ideologies, surely not only believers. 3 years later, he elevated Maximilian Kolbe to sainthood to mark the eternity of human dignity, stronger even than death.